This precisely was the most disheartening thing, that the habit of despair is worse than despair itself. Still, when abstraction sets to killing you, you gotta get busy with it. Anyhow, we'll all be nuts before long, unless I'm much mistaken. Bonsoir, this is David.
This is Nathan.
And this is Nick, and welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast, where today we're talking about the 1947 novel The Plague by Albert Camus. In this novel, a rat-infested plague descends on Oran, a city in northern Africa, and proceeds to wreak havoc on the entire city. It is closed, gates are shut, lovers have to figure out how to be separated, isolation ensues, destruction continues. And so we're reading this because we're currently in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're searching for how much, if anything, this tells us in terms of clues for how to interpret our own current surroundings. So perhaps the best question to start with is, are you guys getting the same emotions when you read this? Are you feeling the resonance for the events and the stresses and the anxieties that the characters in The Plague are going through? Are you feeling those yourself?
No, to be honest.
No.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot that's relevant about the book, a lot that's relevant in terms of like kind of surprisingly relevant. About how the government responds to it, how people kind of deny it, how people respond to what's happening in different ways, and then ultimately how the plague starts to wrap up and people get on with their lives. And that's a lot. That's very relevant. But I think to me, just to compare it to what's going on now, at least for many of us, myself included, is how distant our version of the plague feels versus the bubonic plague that's literally killing people in the streets in this book. And I think it's an interesting, in a way, in this book, in The Plague, there's a clear and present enemy that eventually, after the denial of the first part of the book, everybody gets on board with, and they're like, okay, that's the enemy. Now we have to figure out how to continue. And very much, I think, in this situation, in our pandemic, at least for many of us in the United States, the enemy is much more it's hard to define because you don't know anybody who's died from it. I don't know anybody who's died from it. I'm tangentially connected to people who've had it, but what's clear and present are restrictions placed by the government against an invisible enemy and this, I think, is the great irony, we'll likely never see. Likely, the gates will be opened. We'll be asked to begin going about our lives, and we will have actually never seen anything more direct than people wearing masks in the streets, which is, I think, more unsettling than having a clear enemy that we can all rally against.
I wouldn't say it's more unsettling. I would say losing half the population of a city is definitely more unsettling.
I mean, in terms of wow.
Welcome to empathy practice.
Yeah. There's something existential though about not being able to define in your own head what you are supposedly fighting against. I think, it's unsettling. A clear enemy that is very
the way you described
dangerous
it
is unsettling.
I'm having a hard time imagining that you feel that people are fighting anything except for maybe boredom and economic struggle.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not suggesting that nobody's fighting it. I mean, certainly there are, the healthcare workers are certainly fighting it in a much more real way. And I'm sure that after this whole thing, if you're in the healthcare profession, you'll have come out of it with a incredibly different experience than virtually everybody else. So for the majority of the population, we are very insulated from what devastation is happening. And I think for those of us who are, have the ability to work remotely and have a decent place to live, we're fantastically isolated from what's happening.
Yeah, but I mean, there were similarities to that too in the plague as they were going through. I mean, it struck in the less sanitized, poorer areas. Certainly, people, certain characters would go about their own disaster capitalism and profit off of this. Certainly there was the tensions and the pressures put on the shoulders of those who were on the front lines, Dr. Ryu and others, right? So I think I see your point as to like the level of abstraction. And I think you're right. Like right now, that feels incrementally more in that direction. But when I read this, like there's a lot of, especially like the arc of this, right? Because this is kind of put into acts in a way, right? And there's kind of like on the way up and then coming on the way down. And right now, as we're recording this in the middle of April, people are already asking about what does it look like on the way down for us. Mm-hmm. And if you read some of these things, you can kind of start to see that Camus actually had a pretty good feeling for, what these things look like. And I think it's actually interesting that, this was supposed to be written as an allegory for World War II. But when we talk about our pandemic in current times, we talk about it in terms of war. So we're actually flipping the two. Camus' The Plague is about war, and our pandemic, we're trying to characterize as war to help us identify it with it better.
But I think that interpretation of this novel being about war is also, I don't buy it as being only that. I think it is much more a vehicle for his, what we call existential, but he would have called absurdist outview on life.
How would you, that's a perfect lead in into like what he puts down in this, but how would you summarize that absurdist philosophy?
That I think he does it in this book and then in his essays or his philosophical writings that he does, The Myth of Sisyphus, which is that life is essentially this monotonous, repetitive pattern, often one of struggle and difficulty, in which there is no end result or true meaning to it. But in that struggle, you must find a way to be happy, to find love, to find meaning for some people, if that's there. But I think Camus would argue against that idea of finding meaning, but rather just to allow to be in that moment. Yeah,
I mean, reading this to me, I'm aware of the time frame that this happened in, or that he wrote it. And maybe it's because we are going through a pandemic, so I can maybe relate to it more directly than any one of us could 10 years ago, or a year ago. But to me, the allegory of World War II didn't seem that relevant any more than he could have written this novel about the occupation of Paris, and it would also, I think, have ended up being about his underlying philosophy that we're thrust into this world unwillingly, have to eventually realize that we're going to die and do something in the meantime.
Yeah. I think it all fits into kind of what you were getting into at the beginning, Nathan, which is all of these things at some level are just abstractions. And like, yes, there are lots of people who can be directly impacted, and there will also be a fraction of the population or demographic that is not as directly impacted. But at some level, these are sort of psychological things that are, I don't want to say constructs, I don't want to say that they're not real, right? But these big macro events that stress everyone equally, right? I guess in Camus' case, this is an epidemic, but now we're talking about a pandemic. So whatever emotion you're having is actually part of this bigger macro thing. It can no longer be confined to your individual events or circumstances. It's actually you're part of a bigger thing that no individual can do anything against.
But I think that's existentialism in a nutshell, right? It's like, so he takes this metaphor of the plague, but like in reality, the reality that we all exist in is that we are not each on our own separate vessels heading towards our each own unique destinies. We are collectively on one ship heading towards our own demise. And that's the most unifying concept that exists.
Yeah.
And within that, we individualize ourselves, and we choose whether or not to pursue goodness, saintliness, God, material possessions, love, happiness, what have you. And I think that's the meat of the book, is you have these characters who each resolve themselves to this epidemic in different ways. That maybe it doesn't cleanly fall into archetypes. I think the characters are more complete than that. But I think he is primarily using this as a vehicle to explore why try to do good. Basically, we all have to ask ourselves, or I think we do. Maybe there's some purely nihilistic people out there, but basically, why do good and not bad? Why put up a fight against something that is larger than you and larger than that might kill you, that very well could kill you? Why put up a fight for that and not, go off and try to have a little bit of fun?
Yeah, and that's kind of always to me, there's kind of like the pop definition of existentialism, and then there's kind of some of the more direct writings on it. And like one of the more positive spins on it is that once you remove that, that concept that there is the higher power, or there is something that's providing some sort of arc or destiny, that you now have the ability to focus on the things at the smaller level, because you're not going to change the thing at the bigger level, or nothing is actually planned, or it's not, it's not pre-written, right? So actually, when you think of the character of like Theroux being kind of the atheist saint, and his whole speech about trying to be for something and realizing that in the process of being for something, he was actually inadvertently also being against it, more so than when he started out. So the thing that he was fighting was the thing that he ended up becoming. And so he wanted to simplify things to just be basically good. And that was his whole atheist, saintly attempt. And of course, in the end, he was claimed by the plague, which is a bit of, I guess, throwing back to David's point, the absurdist conclusion and the absurdist component of this book. Is it even worth pursuing that?
The funny thing to me about the writing is that it doesn't seem absurd to me at all. I mean, maybe the absurdity is that ultimately he doesn't have an answer. He doesn't provide an answer. But it's his writing is so humanist, really.
Yeah, that is the conclusion, right? Even the priest near the end, or after he began to work with the, I forget what they called themselves, our ragtag team of cleaners and doctors, whatever they're called. But even Panaloo, the priest, at the end, they have this thing, it's just like a one little line. Instead of saying you, he now said we. And I think that shows one thing, because in the beginning, you see his fiery sermon, he's saying you did this because of God is doing this to you. Like it was almost like he removed himself from it as this purveyor of truth who knew something that they didn't. But in the end, he was reduced. And in the end, he also succumbed to the disease. But he saw that, as Nathan said, we are all on the ship going towards our own demise. So in the end, in the face of an absurd reality where death is inevitable and constant and hanging over our heads, really all we have is each other, essentially, to fight against that thing, because there is nothing else. We are here. That's all we know. What else can we do? Right.
Which is why this book was kind of a little bit like a romance, a rom-com, if you will.
More like a bromance. It's just a bunch of dudes hanging out, getting to know each other.
This was the prequel to I Love You, Man.
Yeah.
So, David, you said that all we can do is fight against it.
That's a method that's not a method. Sorry, that's a message that he kind of hits home a lot. Which is, I think, where the war thing comes in. Because I wish I could find this quote. He makes a reference to the difference between resistance and fighting somewhere in the novel. I don't know where it is, but throughout the book, he mentions this idea of fighting because that's all there is to do, right? So earlier in the novel, or maybe midway point, here's a quote. It says, "Many fledgling moralists in those days were going about our town proclaiming there was nothing to be done about it, and we should bow to the inevitable. and Teru, Ryo, and their friends might give one answer or another, but its conclusion was always the same. Their certitude that a fight must be put up, in this way or that, and there must be no bowing down. The essential thing was to save the greatest possible number of persons from dying and being doomed to unending separation. And to do this, there was only one resource, to fight the plague. There was nothing admirable about... There was nothing admirable... fuck me. There was nothing...
No, we leave mistakes in now. That's like our new... It's like our new aesthetic.
Yeah. There was nothing admirable about this attitude. It was merely logical.
Yeah, I mean, that quote's super badass, right?
I want to stick with that quote for a second, though, because I feel like calling it logical, I don't buy Camus' argument.
That just shows you who the real narrator is, which we can get to later, which the frame narrative is absurd in a different way. But
absurd isn't bad.
Yeah, isn't bad. But I think up until that, yeah, go ahead. Nathan, go ahead.
I say you don't. Wait, but Nathan, you don't like that quote?
No,
I think that quote's awesome because I've had so many conversations with friends where we all yell at each other about like what's gonna happen, like in our times with the pandemic, and everybody's trying to like some person's like that moralist who's like, well, it's just gonna happen, so who cares? And then someone else is like, well, no, we got to do these things, and like everybody's grappling on these things, and they're just like cranking on it, and there's nothing to do except your own small microcosm and do what you can to quote unquote fight it. That's like it. And that's the simplicity of it. But yet we can still wrap ourselves around in these different philosophies. And, we even see this at like the political level, right? There's like rallies against like government responses and like our president's trying to liberate states on capitalized tweets. Like it's all super bizarre, but at the end of the day, it's just like individual actions and effort.
Yeah, but it's only logical if you start from a certain basic assumption, and I feel like he doesn't approach that basic assumption, or he does a few times, but I think he doesn't, in my mind, really deal with it. What's his name, the romantic
Rambert,
yeah. He says when he has his lover, his girlfriend, his wife.
He says it's his wife, but I think they're not married.
His love interest
doesn't matter.
Who's in Paris, and he's a journalist and had just happened to be in Iran when the plague breaks out, and he really wants to get out, and he just fights against the plague in a different way than like Ryu.
I wouldn't say he's fighting against it. I'd say he's running away from it.
Okay, sure. Okay, so his approach to it is opposed to Ryo and Teru.
Yeah.
Which is, to run away from it, to escape, to get out of this predicament.
Because he keeps calling himself an outsider. Sorry. But he's like, I'm not a part of this. I'm not even supposed to be, I shouldn't be here. I'm not from this town. But at the end, he realizes that he is. And I think that's kind of the point, is that granted, like a lot of parables, he sort of isolates it in this small community because you have to, because you want it to represent some larger idea, because it's easier that way. But Camus is, whether you want to say it's graceful or not, is setting up something that is one of his philosophical points, is that you can escape from this. Yes, you can run away from it. But the greater thing to do, the nobler thing to do, would be to stay and fight. And I think that's what you get in him.
I think that is what he believes, and I respect his earnestness in trying to communicate that. I just don't think that it's actually that intellectually honest. And I think so. Take Rambert. We can agree that the noble thing to do is for him to accept his circumstance and fight against the plague alongside these other guys who are more associated with this place. But he says, when he decides to do that, he says, "For nothing in the world is it worth turning one's back on what one loves. Yet that is what I'm doing. The why I do not know." And I think it's sort of, he's been written in this book to do something that seems inevitable, but it's obviously not inevitable. And so the reason that he changes his mind is for, empathy for one's fellow man.
But I don't think it's just that. Earlier in the book, our narrator says, the language he used was that of a man who was sick and tired of the world he lived in, though he had much liking for his fellow men, and had resolved for his part to have no truck with injustice and compromises with the truth. So I think in the end he realized, or to him, this is a sort of a greater injustice would be to flee and to pretend like he can't do anything.
Yeah.
Even though later he doesn't acknowledge that truth, I think it's there within him. And Camus establishes that early because as a reader, maybe you can call back upon that, or you see that in him, or maybe he doesn't see that necessarily in himself, but it is a part of who he is. And originally the reason he was there is as a journalist to describe these poor parts of town, to let people know how things were going, right? So there's a certain sense of wanting justice within this man, and he's torn between escaping the plague for something that he loves, or that he thinks he loves, and sticking it out.
Yeah, I mean, the question is like, did it give him purpose, or did it allow him to find the purpose that was kind of already within? But like, the thing about that character that to me stands out is actually when the plague is ramping down, there's this period where people are having to transition back out of it. And I'll read a passage from that, where it says that for even Rambert felt a nervous tremor at the thought that soon he would have to confront a love and a devotion that the plague months had slowly refined to a pale abstraction with the flesh and blood woman who had given rise to them. So like at this point, he's entirely physically and emotionally involved in this fight, in this purpose. And the only thing that he cared about previously, somewhat selfishly or maybe just romantically, was seeing his wife, right? And now he's having to grapple with actually kind of owning up to that. Was that more important than the love and the effort that he put in fighting the plague? Right? So like, I don't know. I think there is a sense of purpose that he has. So I don't know if it's like what would you call it, the not being intellectually honest, but maybe actually there is some character development there, or some personal development on the part of Rambert. Yeah,
and I guess that's fine. And maybe I'm looking at this, I'm trying to pull out the philosophical points that he's trying to make, which ought to be objective, right? Not just this particular character's particular development, but what that's telling us about humankind's relationship to the world. So, I mean, he drops philosophy like between these characters a lot, or between the story a lot, to the degree that it's like, is this philosophy or is this a novel? He speaks in aphorisms.
It's called a philosophical novel.
There were a lot of them in the mid-century, and they all were sort of the same in that respect. Yeah. Yo, nobody talks like that. Nobody has that kind of dialogue, man.
Yeah, no one goes on 3 pages of rant. I know it reminds me of being a teenager or like a college kid, like getting really into like a philosophical novel.
Yeah.
More because of the ideas than the writing or the plot or anything else, which I still appreciate it if it's done well, as we know from our previous couple discussions about Ursula K. Le Guin's, in my mind, complete failure to do what I think Camus did a good job of here. But anyway, I want to go back to what Nathan is saying, which he seems to find some sort of hole in the argument. Well,
I think, okay. So it's. I think the fundamental point that he's trying to make is, or the fundamental question that he's raising, and I think maybe he doesn't answer the question, but the question is, why do good? I think.
Well, I think he answers it in how the characters act and how you are meant to see them.
So you're saying there's not a logical argument. There's a humanist, empathetic argument.
Yeah, I mean it's logical in terms of, so there really is nothing else that can be done, but doing this thing is, I guess, the right thing to do.
But why? Because I think we agree on that, because I think in large part, I think the important question is why? Why do we think that's the right thing to do? Why do we think that's noble? And why do we think that's good? Because the whole point of existentialism and the removing of God from the equation, the removing of authority from the equation, is that the weight is now on you. You have to figure it out. So all of these characters, except for even the priest, I think, after he witnesses the death of the child, really has to confront himself about why is he doing what he does, because it's like he's reached a breaking point as far as the assumptions in faith that he has made. So I think it's a cop-out to just say like, well, they did the noble thing because it's the right thing to do. And ultimately, they did it out of empathy or whatever, unless we're saying that it is that, yeah, without God, without morality, without authority, human beings are fundamentally empathetic. But that's not even carried out in the book. So, because we have characters who are not empathetic. Not a lot of them, but there's a few.
So you're asking, how can there be morality without God, essentially?
That's the question that's raised repeatedly in the sort of existential genre. But I think it's Camus' interest specifically, because I think Camus does believe in goodness, and he does believe in nobility, and he does believe in all these things. And to me, I see that each of these characters basically believes in something that they no longer have a strong foundation to continue to believe in that. That's what I see.
I mean, I feel like the argument for this that's made is in that big, many-page long Theroux speech, right? And I'll read maybe a large chunk of it, where he says, "All I maintain is that on earth there are pestilences and there are victims, and it's up to us, so far as possible, not to join forces with the pestilences. That may sound simple to the point of childishness. I can't judge if it's simple, but I know it's true. You see, I've heard such quantities of arguments which very nearly turned my head and turned other people's heads enough to make them approve of murder. And I'd come to realize that all our troubles spring from our failure to use plain, clean-cut language. So I resolved always to speak and to act quite clearly, as this was the only way of setting myself on the right track. That's why I say there are pestilences and there are victims, no more than that. If, by making that statement, I too become a carrier of the plague germ, at least I don't do it willfully. I try, in short, to be an innocent murderer. You see, I have no great ambitions." I think that's the point. Like, it is as simple as that. And I don't know how to like frame it in a way that seems more or less logical than that. Maybe it is simply a logically humanist type of thing. But everything has contradictions, and everything has a seesaw effect, a pro and a con. And whenever you're helping something, you're probably hurting someone else, right? And so the simplest thing is to try to reduce it to something as straightforward as possible and be honest and go do the thing, right? Rather than trying to create these more complex, systems and things like that. I think that's essentially the argument of the novel, is trying to reduce things down to the baseline, bare morality of it all, which I find uplifting, honestly. I that's kind of like...
I do too.
Yeah.
That's rad, right?
I mean, almost too uplifting. Almost like hollowly uplifting. Almost like a Thomas Kincaid painting.
I think it's sort of an inspirational thing. Like, if there's one, I'm gonna step like a little bit further out. I'm gonna come back in. If there's one thing I love about like the Camus writing, is that it just reminds me of like really good like straight edge like hardcore punk bands that have like these like lyrics and lines that are so like fundamentally true and like emphatic and like honest that they're kind of stupid in a way because they're too simple. Like, that's just not how the world works. And I feel like I get that same emotion like listening to those songs as I do like reading this book, because I read that and I'm like, damn, that's right. I'm gonna like go out and start today.
Yeah,
I'm gonna do something different.
It's like a Pennywise song.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I saw like Earth Crisis like a month or two ago, along with like Snapcase and Strife, like classic 90s. Like,
those bands still exist?
Yeah, they just played shows and it was fucking awesome.
I used to love Snapcase, like, man. They were awesome.
Yeah. Oh no, it was great. They're all like they're all dads and stuff now, and they're all just as simple and angry like in their lyrics and stuff. It's beautiful. Just like Camus. But yeah, like it boils it down into such this like pure thing, and it's not even like ideological at a certain level, because it's like simpler than that. It's more like
it's humanist to the most refined thing, is that human life is sacred by itself as its own bizarre, absurd, fleeting existence. That itself is important, and you need to fight for it and fight for others. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Other than, like, why is it sacred? Because it's fleeting and absurd and often painful, and it ends, and then that's it. The ultimate separation, or whatever it was that he calls it, right? That's it. So if you're not fighting for it, then you are a victim of the plague. If you're not fighting for life, living for today, as Nick's punk bands probably are still screaming, then, what are you doing? I mean, we could go down a bunch of terrible, terrible, sappy road quotes. I guarantee Stephen King read this book and stole some lines for his Shawshank Redemption story. But what's the famous quote from that? Either get busy living or get busy dying, right?
Amen. I listened to that song lyric.
So, sorry, Nathan, no system for you to deconstruct. I mean, maybe there is, but I don't know.
No, I mean, to be honest, I enjoyed the book. I like Camus. I think it's deeply empathetic. To me, it just kind of doesn't quite get there philosophically. It doesn't quite get there as a novel. It's a book that reaffirms my desire to believe the things I desire to believe, but it doesn't go much further than that to me. It doesn't make me feel like my beliefs have been strengthened at all. It just kind of sets up a scenario, and then things happen the way that basically I would hope that they would happen in an ideal way.
Yeah, watching. Again, 50% of the population die, kids suffer in pain. This is what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, are you like emotionally vacant in a way that we haven't like fully cracked until now?
Are you not aware of this?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a novel, right? It's a story. It's telling you something.
It's a philosophical novel.
And thanks for the clarification.
Genre fiction.
So in this scenario, the walls are closed off. People are stuck in this scenario. We accept that situation. And then within that, what's going to happen? Heroes emerge. People do good and heroic things, and they don't take credit for it. The greatest characteristics, the most noble characteristics rise to the top. Tell me that's not what you hope would happen in that scenario. You don't hope that people would die, but people die. Wars happen, plagues happen, bad things happen, and then we figure out what to do about it. So that's the important part. And in this story, people rise to the occasion and they do amazing things.
Of course, that's what happens. But I think that is part of the flaw of the novel for me, is that it is very simplistic. Like, things happen in a way that are pretty straightforward. And I don't expect things not to happen that way. But I still respect the characters for doing what they do and struggling in the way that they struggle, because it is a sort of reaffirmation of my humanistic outlook on life and absurd philosophy that I tend to adhere to. So does it do anything to challenge those ideas? Not really. Does it make my own belief system stronger? No.
I would just like to note that we're like arguing on, I think, what's kind of like a finer point here, and we're doing it kind of intensely, which I think might only be happening because we've just all spent a month by ourselves. So maybe this is the document, right? It's not actually what the book is. It's just getting mad at each other whether or not this is logically humanist or humanely logical.
I mean, whatever. I feel like that's the story of my life. Everyone's like, Nathan, nobody cares. That's not the point.
Nathan,
Nick,
I care.
Yeah.
I care.
I care. Otherwise, I wouldn't argue.
But why?
It's not your fault.
Why do you care?
It's not your fault.
Why do you care? Is there a God?
No, but that's why I care.
Oh. Transition. Head into the new topic.
Yeah.
I wrote a new topic.
Okay. My favorite character in the whole book.
Cotard?
Everybody has to say their favorite character. Let's say this. Yeah. No, my favorite character is Grand. The old dude who like lost his love because he couldn't advance in his career and spends all his days trying to write the perfect sentence.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that, because sometimes when we work on art projects, I feel like that's your skill, is refining that little tiny thing to perfection.
I mean,
that's what I love about you, because Nathan,
I
care. Nathan, I care.
I mean,
you're going to come out of this a different person, just like Rambert in The Plague.
Did he?
No, he stayed the same.
You're going to find purpose. So my favorite character in this book was the real narrator, not the fake narrator.
Camus?
Basically Camus. Basically, I just like Camus. He's the best. He's the best character in this book, is Camus.
I mean, it was obviously Camus. He just had to like hide behind a curtain at the very end.
Yeah, and he's like, I'm gonna try real hard to make this into some sort of fictional plot device, and I'm gonna go out of my way to talk about it constantly. I'm gonna try to give it all sorts of meaning and reasons why I did this, but in reality, this is just me, which I'm okay with. It's a good character.
I think my favorite character was the old Spanish lady that made fun of Rambert, who said, don't you believe in God? And he's like, he said no or something like that he did not. And he's like, oh yeah. She says, that explains it. You must go back to her, or else what would be left of you? And she just kind of cut him down to size, like, clearly you have nothing in your life except a woman to chase after. No, I don't really have any favorite characters. I like, they all kind of feel like aspects of the same hero in different ways, but yeah, I don't know.
I'm curious what y'all's take on Cotard was, because we didn't talk about that character at all. And he's totally an outlier, but I feel like significant. You know, Camus holds as the most fundamental existential question is whether or not to commit suicide. And this character at the very beginning of the book attempts suicide. So that to me is kind of it's like, hey, pay attention to this guy. And then during the plague he's the only one who kind of becomes happy about it. His life improves, his outlook improves. And when it ends, he starts shooting at random people and kills a dog in the street. So he's kind of the foil, I think, to our book of heroes. So what does that mean? He's
the last bit of cloud hanging over everybody's head as a reminder. That's how I kind of viewed him. He's a reminder that the world is absurd and death can come at any moment.
This pestilence exists, and either you're part of the pestilence or you're fighting against it. Is he the omnipresent pestilence?
Yeah.
Yeah, like chaos is constant and consistent. It just might come in different categories, right? So like as the chaos of the plague grows, he oddly feels comforted by it and doesn't have to do his own individual, contributions to it. And then as sort of that subsides and real life kind of goes back, then he returns to his old ways. Like I was thinking about this today when I was driving and I was crossing the Bay Bridge at like noon on a Saturday, which I would never swear on anyone. Because that's just traffic. And there was this dude who was driving like 100 miles an hour across the bridge, weaving inside of everyone out, or weaving in and out. And it made me realize that I was oddly comforted by it because there's still some stupid guy that needs to speed at 100 miles an hour in like difficult, like changing 6 lanes at once. Like regardless of whatever's happening at the macro scale, there's still this guy who's making stupid fucking decisions right now. And I was just like, all right, I think the world's gonna persevere somehow because that guy still exists. There's been no change.
He's fighting it, bro. He's fighting it.
Yeah. So I think that's it. Like, yeah, there's the macro chaos and then there's the micro chaos, and they're all part of like a consistent, balanced equation somehow. I mean, this isn't like we should get into like whether or not this is a good work of fiction, because I still love this thing, but I don't know. I mean, I was reading a Toni Morrison book like in parallel, and she's just like 9,000 times a better writer, like in every respect. Like her prose is better, and obviously this is perhaps an older translation, so maybe this is just a little not perfect to start with. But it's just like somebody who's like writing finely crafted fiction with good character development and like cool nonlinear narration, like all that stuff, like versus this still just, it's the classic thinly veiled ideas. It's a novel.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I like this book in the same way that I like, early 2000s emo. It's like I still like it, sometimes I'll turn it on and it like reaffirms me in a certain way, but it's not the best music and it's also not as intelligent as it thinks it is.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I'm with you.
Because I think you could write this story, like if we want to make the empathetic humanistic argument, which is like, I think that is the argument of literature, to be honest, is that you flesh out a character and then suddenly you don't have to ask yourself these mathematical questions. You get it. You get their situation, you get what they care about, and that you develop as a human being. And you don't have to make a logical argument for that.
I think what Camus was attempting to do was say that you don't have to do that with an individual necessarily. You see all these different characters, you see the multiplicity of characters, and what they're going through is because they're all sort of going through what Camus would probably describe as the same thing, which is life itself, the plague. And it's kind of seeing how people react. But because he reduces it to a plague, I think you lose something in the actual struggle of daily life. He sort of removes it from that, and that makes it a little bit harder to pierce into that sort of thing, right? Into what else could it be? But I think there's a limitation to what his philosophy is in the book, and then how he sort of surrounds it with the plot device of the plague trapping this town. Because once you remove the plague, and again, I think it depends what you want to interpret the plague as. Is it just this cloud of death that hangs over everybody? Is that all it is? And when we're aware of it, we behave in a certain way, and when we're not, we don't? Is that what he's trying to argue?
I mean, I think so. I mean, he has another one of my favorite characters is the asthma patient.
Yeah.
Who kind of introduces the plague at the beginning. He's like, the rats are out, and he's really excited. And then eventually all the rats die off. And at the end, the doctor goes and visits the asthma patient again, and he does the same thing. He's like, you wouldn't believe it, the rats are back, because now the plague's over and the rats aren't all dead. So he's kind of a weird bracket to the book. He's kind of a hermit and retired from the world. He's an interesting character.
Counting peas, hanging out in bed.
Just counting peas. He's a sort of resigned himself from the world. But he says, all those folks are saying it was plague. We've had the plague here. You'd almost think they're expected to be given medals for it. But what does that mean? Plague. Just life. No more than that.
There it is. I mean, that fits in well like the closing sentences of this book, like the concept of, is this something that's there all along and we just sometimes notice it and sometimes don't, right? Is it that cloud of death, and sometimes we have the miraculous benefit to escaping that from like how much we can pay attention? And so this is the last full sentence of the book. So he says, he knew what those jubilant crowds did not know, but could have learned from books, that the plague never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years in furniture and linen chest, that it bides its time in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, and bookshelves, and that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. So yeah, I like that summary of it, which is, this is omnipresent. It's just whether or not it rises up, and obviously that has a direct connection to our current pandemic situation. That's certainly what people are trying to figure out. What does it look like afterwards? Is there even a definition of afterwards? But yeah, it's essentially, it's always there. It's just whether or not you consciously notice it or whether or not it makes itself noticed. I
don't know if we're trying to wrap up. Seems like that was kind of a pretty good closing, but I kind of want to keep talking. Keep Nick away.
There's no rules. We don't have anything to do. This is life. This is our life now.
This is life now. I mean, I'm not going anywhere. I don't know about you guys. But a book that this reminded me of in a weird way is Don DeLillo's White Noise, because
it's a good quarantine book.
And it's been a while since I read it, so correct me, but this is what I took away from it. He gets some sort of radiation poisoning and gets diagnosed with cancer at the beginning of the book, but then there's like an indefinite period of time that it may take to kill him. And all he's left with is the realization that he's dying, and he can't let go of that realization. But of course, we're all dying in a certain regard. And in the next, we all have this cancer that's going to kill us in the next 80 years. It could be tomorrow. It could be in 80 years, but we all have it. I guess that was it. That was my point.
Maybe that's the end of the episode. Thanks for listening. As always, you can find us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle BooksOSubstance. So it's a dialogue between Teru and Ryu. And so it says, Teru nodded. Yes, but your victories will never be lasting. That's all. Ryu's face darkened. Yes, I know that. But it's no reason for giving up the struggle. No reason, I agree. Only, I now can picture what this plague must mean for you. Yes, a never-ending defeat. Teru stared at the doctor for a moment, then turned and tramped heavily towards the door. Ryu followed him and was almost at his side when Teru, who was staring at the floor, suddenly said, "Who taught you all this, doctor?" The reply came promptly, "Suffering."